Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Kayla Winarski-Green, and I'm an advisor on human rights and business at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, Denmark's national human rights institution. Today, I am very fortunate to be joined in conversation by Professor Surya Dev, Vice Chair of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. In today's conversation, we will share relevant insights from our work, particularly including a specific focus on human rights due diligence and gender. So with this in mind, I figured we would start on a high level, and I would turn to you, Surya, and ask, why does integrating a gender perspective while conducting human rights due diligence matter? Where do you see the added value?
Thank you very much, Kayla. It's my pleasure to join you in this conversation on the occasion of the International Women's Day. It's really wonderful. As listeners may know, human rights due diligence is a process which is aimed at identifying, mitigating, preventing, and addressing adverse impact on human rights by businesses. And I think the key element is because rights holders are different, men and women, boys and girls. And I think it is absolutely vital that businesses adopt a gender perspective. Otherwise, they may not be able to understand how the activities of businesses are impacting women differently. So the first point is that the women are impacted differently in many situations, whether it is sexual harassment, whether it is issues about pregnancy or the care work that women are doing, or the impact of pollution of water on women. All these impacts are felt by women differently. In some cases, the impacts can also be disproportionate. For instance, if we look at the data on modern slavery, ILO estimates that more than 70% of the victims are women and girls. So if we do not adopt a gender perspective, it is very likely that businesses will not be able to capture this differentiated and disproportionate impact on women and girls. The second element is that women and girls also face additional barriers in accessing remedies for business-related human rights abuses. For instance, there are social norms and cultural practices. There could be online shaming, and women are not expected to go to the court or approach even non-judicial systems to make a complaint. And those additional barriers may also prohibit them from seeking access to justice in those cases. And my third and the last point is that unless we adopt a gender perspective in committing human rights due diligence, the existing discrimination and patriarchal norms that they exist in society, they may not be taken into account. So whether it is about issues about land, for instance, land ownership, women only own, let us say, about 20 to 25% of the land in the world. So if we ignore this fact, and we have a company which is acquiring the land, and it plans to compensate the owners of the land, then women, even if they're working on the land for livelihood, they'll be left out, right? So I think there are many factors, but I would stop at these three factors, which make it critical that this gender approach adopted in committing human rights due diligence. And just to continue this conversation, Kayla, as you know, all of us are facing this COVID-19 pandemic at this particular point of time. And even this dialogue that we are having is done virtually because of that situation, right? So what lessons can we learn from the impact of COVID-19 on women and girls? What has been your research on this from the Danish Institute for Human Rights in terms of how women and girls have been impacted differently, and how should we operate differently in future to create a more just recovery?
Yes, thank you for asking me about that. I really think it would be impossible to have this conversation about gender lens without including a focus on COVID-19, given all of the relevant impacts. So at the Danish Institute, as you note, many of our recent activities have focused on the impacts of COVID. In our recent blog series, which we've put out in conjunction with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and of course, which you're familiar with, Surya, as you've contributed a great piece on gender bias in artificial intelligence. Several of the pieces in that series have focused on various ways in which COVID-19 has impacted women and girls. We've had a piece on protecting migrant women workers in the food supply chains during the pandemic. And we have a piece which I authored on how to best support single working mothers during the pandemic who are facing double, if not triple work, their normal employment, and of course care work with limited to no familial support. In addition to some of the recent scholarship that we've put out, recent multi-stakeholder discussions and consultations that we've held have also focused on these impacts. We've particularly looked at how this relates to women workers, care work, and sexual and gender-based violence. So we've had very many productive dialogues and studies. And in each of these ventures, we've noted specific areas of concern, but also opportunities. And we've seen that now these issues are receiving increased focus and attention, which we hope will not go away as the pandemic wanes. So of course, there have also been some benefits here as these issues are being uniquely considered and looked at. But of course, because I have the great fortune of speaking to the vice chair of the working group on business and human rights, I have to ask about the gender framework. So if I may, would you be able, Surya, to please speak a little bit about how the UN working group gender framework for the UNGPs assists businesses?
Thank you, Kayla, for this question, and thank you also for the sharing about the impact of COVID-19, which has kind of worsened the discrimination against women, which is very well documented by many institutions and organizations all over the world. And I would also add issues about domestic violence before I turn to the framework. Domestic violence is something which has been there in societies all over the world to a different degree and extent. And because of the pandemic, I think that situation has really worsened quite dramatically, and which is quite worrying. And I think we should do something very seriously about this. Now, let me revert to the framework that you mentioned. So the working group on business and human rights started this project on gender lens in 2017. And after a round of regional consultations all over the world, we proposed a report to the Human Rights Council in June 2019. And this report does two things. It provides a gender framework for the UN guiding principles, and it also provides a specific guidance on each of the 31 principles of the UNGPs. And we felt that this kind of a practical guidance is needed, because if you look at national action plans, or if you look at the human rights due diligence processes of different businesses, we felt that they were not really taking on board the gender dimensions. And we felt that if concrete guidance is available to both states and businesses, then hopefully they will integrate a gender perspective in implementing the UN guiding principles, and that will contribute to achieving substantive gender equality. But let me briefly talk about the framework. Now, this framework is kind of a cycle, and it has 3 steps. The first step is gender responsive assessment. And mind it, it is not impact assessment, it is assessment. Because sometimes some impacts are not caused by businesses, but they may already be there in society, in the operating context. So I think the starting point for any business or any state is to look at assess the situation in a responsive manner. And let us say if a business finds that there are too many complaints about sexual harassment, but that is the assessment that they find. Then the next stage is they should be gender responsive, and I would say rather gender transformative measures. So what needs to be done to change the dynamic, right? And the third step in that cycle is gender transformative remedies. So what you will notice is that in this cycle, it is not merely enough to be sensitive. We're talking about responsiveness and transformation. So responsiveness in terms of assessing the impact, and transformative in terms of the steps you take, and transformation in terms of the remedies that may be needed. Because the ultimate goal should be to change the power structures and dismantle the patriarchal norms, whether social norms, religious norms, cultural norms, or legal norms that are there, that are impeding achievement of substantive gender equality in society. In addition to this framework, which is very generic, And it's a normative framework which can be applied, I would say, in a different context. For instance, we can look at even from the perspective of indigenous people. Because women are only one part of the rights holders, right? But the key issue that we need to keep in mind is that all the rights holders are different. And I think we have to be sensitive to those differences. And even amongst women, we have to be aware of the issue of intersectionality. Like all women are not the same. So issues of gender, race, caste, religion, language, migration status, all those variables are going to become quite relevant if you're looking at. So we very much hope that this kind of a framework plus practical guidance is going to guide businesses in particular when they're implementing Pillar 2 and looking at Pillar 3 in terms of access to remedy, to take concrete steps in terms of due diligence or access to remedy. We believe that all these things should be rights-based, because we're not talking about any charity here. Because sometimes I was asked in the past, oh, is this an add-on? So we are saying gender lens or gender perspective is not an add-on. It's not an extra thing. It has to be an integral part of it. Unless a business can adopt a gender perspective, it cannot really do meaningful human rights due diligence. So it's not like you sprinkle something on the top of a cake. No, the cake has to be built with this gender perspective in itself. And I think that is where the issue of gender tokenism and achieving gender substantive equality, that is the difference. So we are not sprinkling the word gender here and there to tick the boxes. Rather, we're talking about substantive gender equality, which is absolutely right. And I think this whole world needs to do much more and faster, in my view, to reach that goal. And I think, Kayla, that may provide me to come back to you to ask this question about, because even in Sustainable Development Goals, right, we have, of course, SDG 5. But if you look at all SDGs, the issue of gender equality is embedded into all SDGs implicitly, if not expressly. So what is the role of business that you see in contributing to substantive gender equality under SDG 5 in particular, but generally about Sustainable Development Goals? So what is your feeling on that?
Great, thank you for that. And thank you for giving this sort of positive question. I really appreciated your perspective, and I think I'll be thinking about this cake metaphor quite a lot going forward. So that was very helpful on my end. But of course, back to your question, given existing gender inequalities, it's essential to achieve equal opportunities in access to employment and positions of leadership and decision-making at all levels, and for all relevant actors to strive towards the eradication of gender discrimination. And this should be something that's deeply embedded at companies and not implemented in a tokenistic way. We've explored this quite a bit in our Sustainable Development Through Human Rights Due Diligence portal, which has a dedicated page on gender discrimination, in which we highlight several examples of corporate best practices in striving towards gender equality. For example, we discuss one company which adopts a policy supporting employees who are victims of domestic violence and abuse, which, as you noted earlier, is really something that's very critical at this moment. We also highlight additional best practices, such as another company which gives a benefits package which allows parents, irrespective of gender, and including adoptive parents, to take 52 weeks of shared parental leave. So these are just some of the best practices that we highlight. But as you noted, we also sort of underpin this with SDG synergies and with relevant targets. So this portal also notes all of the relevant SDG goals and targets which underpin this gender discrimination issue. And this is underpinned by previous research that the Institute has conducted in 2018, which we found that 92% of SDG targets are linked to human rights mechanisms. So we really can't, have these conversations about SDGs and human rights in the abstract. We see them as something that's completely intertwined. And this underlines the necessity of conducting human rights due diligence in general in this context, and the role that gender-sensitive human rights due diligence can have in contributing to the achievement of substantive gender equality, deeply embedded, and of course, the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So this is sort of part of the broader conversation there.
Yeah. No, that is excellent. And I think one more issue, if I may mention here, Kayla, very briefly, is also about looking at other challenges, whether it's about climate change now, or whether it's about the new technologies that we're talking about, right? So I think it is absolutely vital for all of us to consider that whatever we are thinking in the field of human rights or business and human rights, gender responsive approach is a must. And I think we should also not shy away from enforcing the rights-based message here. Of course, often businesses think in terms of a business case. And I agree that there may be a business case in many situations. But I think we should also underline that human rights should not be dependent on a business case.
Yes.
And I think it's a normative thing, it's a moral thing, it's a legal right. And all businesses, and of course all states, have their respective duties and responsibilities. And whatever they do, they must adopt a gender responsive approach and adopt this, right? So with this, I'll pass it back to you, and unless you wish to add anything. And it was wonderful joining you in this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I'm really glad that you underpin that, because of course we share the perspective that there's so much more at stake here than the business case. And I think that it really couldn't be clearer at this period in time that this gender transformative approach must absolutely take place. So on that very inspiring and illuminating note, I noticed that we are at our time allocated for the day. So this brings us to the end of our session. Surya, thank you so much for these insights. Thank you for this conversation. And I think I speak for both.
Thank you, Kayla. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you to the organizers and of course the attendees today. We hope that you enjoyed the conversation, and we encourage you to stay on for the rest of what looks like a very exciting program.